Thanks, Angela. So thanks to IMI for inviting this young organization, probably 1.5 months old, so it's quite young. I'm actually no longer than the director of the division back in Norway, but I'm currently the interim CEO of CEPI for the interim planning phase. And I'm glad to see many of the partners involved in planning and getting this off the ground here in the room today. So I will not spend a lot of time now then on kind of the motivation, because we've already heard that from several of the other speakers. So we know that epidemics are a threat and will continue to be, and there will come new pathogens that we either have known about but never considered them as kind of really public health threats. More importantly, though, is that there is also now, and in particular after Ebola, a very strong set of recommendations from many stakeholders, from high-level panel at the UN, from evaluation panels linked to WHO, to more independent commissions, including to work at, which just been presented by Mary-Paul Kinney on the R&D blueprint. And when it comes to research and development, I think, to put it very bluntly, what they call for is more money, better money, in the sense that we need to increase investments in this space, but we also need to make sure that our investments work more collectively and in a more coherent manner. So CEPI is in many ways an attempt to respond to these calls. And there were several processes, discussions, deliberations in different fora, definitely including the WHO R&D blueprint process, which led to a group meeting at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, continued with then actually getting a mandate for a process, establishing task teams that could work on different issues. I will not go in detail. Convening another meeting in Washington in May, and more or less establishing this organization over the summer in 4 or 5 months period then. Continued discussions, establishing it through a constitutional board meeting in London, launching it in a way that so we wanted to start discussions with the community of researchers and implementers, industry and so forth, but planning for a bigger launch in Davos 1 year after the planning meeting, when we have more clarity on funding and opportunities. We have discussed with the G7 health ministers. We've been at the UN General Assembly discussing with other member states. We will continue with the G20 kind of preparations for next year. So that's the process. And the challenges are really that the pipeline is weak for most emerging infectious diseases, and there is a lack of clear market incentives. There are unilateral, to say it the other way, unilateral or uncoordinated government efforts is not sufficient, and it's inefficient. And it's also unsustainable in addressing global epidemic risks. We need to improve clinical and regulatory pathways. And as I said, incentives are really not there from a private company point of view. At the same time, we have some vaccine pipelines. These are pipelines of the 11 pathogens defined now in the first set of priorities at WHO in the R&D blueprint. They are either in academia, in government agencies, in biotech companies, in multinational companies, or in non-profit organizations. And as you see, most of the pipeline is in preclinical development, and some then have emerged into phase 1, and of course some moving forward. So the opportunities are that the Ebola has created a momentum, and just demonstrated as well by the talk of Mary-Paul Kinney, vaccines are actually feasible to test in an emergency situation. It's possible to advance the clinical development of safe and effective vaccines, there are many actors now more or less converging on a collaborative, a real public-private approach to doing this together. Government health research agencies, academia, biotech company, multinational vaccine manufacturers, and non-profits. And we also acknowledge that manufacturing capabilities and capacities for vaccines will always be a critical bottleneck in the case of an emergency. And we saw that for Ebola. Of course, there are no free pipelines or production facilities ready, and we need to take those crucial resources potentially away from other important public health needs, which is a major concern as well. So we need to also have a capacity to actually respond with some opportunities for dedicated resources. So the CEPI response is to rationalize and accelerate research and development in response to new outbreaks, try to coordinate resources across these actors, and prioritize both platform technologies and specific vaccine targets. And as I said, we will start with the priorities defined by the World Health Organization as the global normative kind of agency, and WHO will continue updating its priority list so that we can work on that. So our vision is that vaccines can contribute to preventing outbreaks from becoming humanitarian crises if they are ready to be explored and used in emergencies. So we will both stimulate, finance, and coordinate vaccine development against emerging infections with epidemic potential, and especially then where their market incentives alone do not achieve this. We want to take an end-to-end approach. We want to move new vaccines through late preclinical studies to proof of concept, phase 2 and safety studies, and also develop platforms that can be rapidly deployed against known and, in particular, unknown pathogens. Our strategic objectives then is to be prepared for the defined pathogens, to advance, as I said, to phase 2 clinical development, a list of key priority candidates, but at the same time so that's a just-in-case strategy with defined pathogens, but also to have a just-in-time strategy where we can respond to emergencies and actually do vaccine development in the case of emergencies. We want to improve predictability, and in particular market predictability, and that's related to the overall clinical and regulatory pathways, and so that it's less uncertainty and make sure that we can actually develop something that can be delivered. And finally, we have an equity objective, equity from two perspectives. One is that, of course, we need to develop vaccines that can actually be used for those populations that would be needing them in an emergency, but also equity in the sense of we want production capacity around the world, and in particular for the opportunity to scale up if there are really epidemics that will be of a larger magnitude. So, as a funder, we believe that the role of CEPI when it comes to vaccine development, and we have focused on vaccine development, you understood that implicitly from what I said, but we have not ruled out diagnostics and therapeutics as a potential kind of next generation investments. But we want to demonstrate that this model, this coalition, can work when it comes to vaccines first. So on the end-to-end spectrum, our role as a funder, as a financer in many ways then would be to move late preclinical promising candidates forward to phase 2 trials. We want to have small stockpiles ready for phase 3 trials, but we also want to team up with then downstream actors, both procurement agencies like Gavi, UNICEF, other actors. So in addition to this funding role, we want to have a convening role together with WHO and other actors, convening regulators, procurers, upstream important R&D funders, so that we have an end-to-end perspective on the full development. I'll skip that one to be. We have defined 3 operating principles. The starting point is equitable access. So the way we invest would need to mean that there needs to be affordable, available vaccines for populations in need across the world. So that's the starting point for any contract, any kind of investment of CEPI. Then there are 2 models in many ways on how we could invest. If CEPI should take almost all of the investment costs, we could do it in a cost coverage model, where CEPI covers all the costs, but thereby also accrue all the kind of rights to actually make sure that the technologies can be utilized and moved forward. The other would be that CEPI, of course, partner with companies, private sector actors who have already put a lot of investments into candidates and technology platforms, and we then add our investments, and then even if we foresee that CEPI vaccines would be not commercially viable, there could definitely in some instances be potentially future commercial opportunities, and then CEPI would have contracts where we in some way could get some of that return back to the CEPI as a non-profit kind of coalition, which could then be reinvested in kind of future research. So those are the models. The organizational setup, what we have done now in this interim phase is that we have established an interim board. We have established an interim scientific advisory committee. I've taken the role to function as a CEO, and then we have a secretariat, which is partly located in Oslo and partly at the other founding organizations. And the founding partners are Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, governments of India and governments of Norway, and the World Economic Forum. But other partners are now invited in, and that's the joint coordination group, because we want this to be an open coalition of all partners that have a role in the end-to-end spectrum on vaccine development. And those partners will sign an MOU kind of committing to the objectives and mission of CEPI, and then have a seat as an institution on the joint coordination group, where we, of course, there will not be decisions, but there will be an advisory function where the different actors can meet, convene, and give advice in many ways to each other and coordinate and align decisions. I will not go in detail, but we have, as I said, quite a large board, maybe too large from a kind of efficiency, effectiveness point of view, but large and good from an inclusive point of view, that we want high-income country governments, we want low and middle-income country governments, we want private sector representatives, we want NGOs and some individual experts. And then we have established, as I said, the Scientific Advisory Committee, which now will also be further extended, so it's also quite big. This needs money. And our starting point is that this is first and foremost a governmental responsibility. It's a public responsibility. But we also have foundations that are showing interest, even foundations that do not necessarily see the area of emergencies and health security as their main priority. And then, of course, you understand I talk about Gates Foundation, who would probably rather prioritize high-burden global health-relevant diseases. But they also see that this is useful from the overall ecosystem and understanding of vaccine development. So the main funding mechanism would be cash funding grants from governments, but we are also exploring the IFIM mechanism. As you know, the IFIM mechanism is used for funding Gavi. We are exploring now with Gavi and the IFIM board whether we can have a similar mechanism to fund CEPI. We have estimated that to move 2 to 3 priority pathogens forward so that we have successful phase 2 candidates. We probably need 2 to 3 candidates for each of those because, of course, there may be failures. That's approximately a $1 billion investment over 5 years. So that's our funding target. So that is not what is needed. More is needed in the sense that if you want to cover all of the 11 pathogens on the WHO list, but we believe this is a feasible target and it's something we will aim for now. We are in the midst now of discussions with governments regarding funding. This is a collective responsibility. I see this as a global health insurance in many ways, a global health risk insurance for country governments. Do you know what is the median country size? What is the median population size of countries in the world? Any idea? The median? No, the median is 6. The average is 33. What does that mean? That most countries in the world, more than half, would be less than 6 million inhabitants. If we want countries to contribute, the only way we can actually do it is to pool resources and do things together at this scale, because no governments would be able to do it alone, except maybe a few. And those are not interested anymore. That's what I hear. So the next steps would be to now have the first meeting of the Scientific Advisory Committee, convene the Joint Coordination Group. We will issue our first call in November is the plan. We will then probably have a dedicated call for some specific vaccine candidates or targets, and a broader call on vaccine technology platforms still to be discussed. Second interim board meeting in India, and then the launch of the coalition in Davos in January. Thank you.